Hello everyone. Tonight we delve into a haunting tale, a story that has been whispered about in the dark corners of small towns for generations. It takes place in a quiet, seemingly peaceful town, nestled amidst the rolling hills of Maine, St. Gabriel's, a town with an aura of simplicity, where the church bell rings at dawn, and the air is thick as with the smell of fresh pine. But beneath this idyllic exterior lies a darkness, one that slowly consumes everything in its wake. The year is 1798, and the townsfolk of St. Gabriel's lead peaceful, unassuming lives. There is a sense of pride in their work, a pride that comes from their deep connection to the land, their families, and their church. But one crisp autumn evening, something unsettling happens. Something that shatters the serenity. The body of a well-known resident is discovered in the churchyard, twisted and lifeless. The cause of death is not obvious, but the look of terror on the man's face sends chills down the spine of anyone who dares to gaze upon him. Rumours start to spread. Fears begin to grow. And the quiet town begins to shift into something darker. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. Also, let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are? And where are you watching from now? Turn off the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some background noise. And let's begin tonight's journey. The discovery of the first victim in the churchyard sent a shockwave through the town, reverberating through every home. The body was found early one cold morning, lying in the freshly fallen leaves, its eyes wide open as if frozen in a final, terrified stare. No marks were left on the body, no signs of struggle. Yet something felt horribly wrong. A sense of dread gripped the hearts of those who first found him. It was as if his death was more than just a tragedy, it was a warning. The authorities were baffled. The town's doctor, a man respected for his knowledge of both the human body and its ailments, examined the body thoroughly. His findings were perplexing. There was no wound, no illness, no apparent cause of death. His final conclusion was that the man had simply died. But that didn't make sense. How could someone die without any apparent reason? As the days passed, more unsettling discoveries were made, more bodies were found, each in similar circumstances. A local woman, once healthy and full of life, was found on the steps of the church. The look on her face was identical to the first victim's, terror etched deeply into her features, her mouth slightly open, as though she had been screaming in those final moments. Again, there were no wounds, no injuries, just the chilling terror that seemed to cling to each of them. The town's whispers grew louder, and speculation ran wild. Was it a sickness, a curse, or was there something far darker lurking beneath the surface? The townspeople began to gather in hushed circles, exchanging their theories and fears. Some suggested it was the work of vengeful spirits. Others feared the land itself was cursed, a result of past sins that had never been atoned for. The church, once a place of solace, began to take on a darker aura. People started to avoid it, walking wide around the cemetery, as if it had become a place of evil. Oh no. The first victim was just the beginning. But who or what was behind this? The answers seemed to be just out of reach, as though the town itself were hiding something it didn't want anyone to know. As the days bled into weeks, the town of St. Gabriel's grew increasingly tense. What had begun as a series of strange deaths slowly turned into a full-blown epidemic of fear. The news of the first two victims had spread to the surrounding towns, and soon, people began to avoid St. Gabriel's altogether. Local merchants refused to deliver goods, and travellers veered away, as if the very land around the church had become tainted. The townspeople, once so tight-knit, and they began to turn on each other. Suspicion was in the air, thick and suffocating. Was the killer among them? Was one of their own responsible for these deaths? The once vibrant marketplace now felt more like a gathering of the guilty, everyone eyeing one another with distrust. It was as if something was festering deep within the town. A secret that no one dared to speak aloud. And then there were the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, strange murmurs that echoed through the night air, filling the streets with a sense of unease. No one knew where they came from, but many of the residents swore they heard voices in the dark, calling to them, beckoning them toward the church. And those who ventured too close, seeking answers, never returned. One evening, a group of villagers gathered in the town square, discussing what to do next. It was then that one of the oldest members of the town, mentioned a forgotten legend, a story that had been passed down through generations but had long been dismissed as nothing more than a tale. According to the legend, St. Gabriel's church had been built upon land stained with blood. Long ago, the town had witnessed a massacre, one that was so brutal, so horrifying, that it had been erased from history. The spirits of those who had been wronged were said to haunt the land, seeking vengeance on anyone who dared to disturb their rest. The mention of this dark history made the hairs on the back of everyone's neck stand on end. Could it be true? Was this the explanation for the terror that was slowly consuming the town? And if it was, could anyone stop it before it was too late? The church, once a symbol of comfort and refuge, now stood as a towering monument to the unknown. Its stone walls, weathered by centuries of history, seemed to whisper with the weight of dark secrets. Its spire reached toward the heavens. But instead of offering peace, it seemed to invite something much darker. The more the townspeople tried to avoid it, the more it seemed to draw them in. They couldn't escape the church's influence. No matter how hard they tried, in the weeks following the discovery of the first two bodies and strange things began happening inside the church. The bells, which had always rung at regular intervals, began to toll erratically. Sometimes they rang in the middle of the night, waking everyone from their sleep. Other times, the bell would toll only once deep, resonant and unsettling. No one knew who or what was causing it, but the noise seemed to carry a dreadful sense of finality. Then, one morning, a group of parishioners went inside to pray, hoping that perhaps their faith could push away whatever evil had taken root in their town. But when they entered Vitera, they found something that defied all logic. Strange markings, symbols none of them recognized were etched into the wooden pews. And the walls, once smooth and unmarred, were now covered in a layer of black soot, as if the very stones had been scorched. No one could explain it. The priest, his face pale and shaking, was at a loss for words. The worst part, however, was the air inside the church. It was thick and stifling, as though the building itself was suffocating under the weight of something unseen. Some who entered began to feel lightheaded, dizzy as if the very air was being drained from their lungs. And there was a strange, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls, as if the church itself was alive. The priest, a man who had served St. Gabriel's for over 30 years, spoke of a feeling he had never experienced before, an overwhelming sense of dread that made him fear for his soul. He had heard stories of curses, of places marked by the supernatural, but he had always dismissed them as folklore. Now, standing in the church that had been his home for so long, he wondered if perhaps some stories were more than just myth. The more the town's secrets began to surface, the more it became apparent that something ancient, Something malevolent had taken root in Gabriel's, and it was slowly, quietly, spreading its tendrils through every corner of the town, leaving nothing untouched. The arrival of an outside investigator should have been a beacon of hope for St. Gabriel's, a sign that answers were finally within reach. Yet, for the people of the town, his presence only seemed to deepen the mystery. His name was Ellis Creed, a seasoned investigator known for solving cases that others deemed unsolvable. He was methodical, calm, and driven, qualities that gave the townspeople a glimmer of hope in the midst of their despair. But from the moment he set foot in St. Gabriel's, something about the place seemed to unnerve him. Creed's investigation began with a thorough examination of the church itself, the place where it all started. As he stepped inside, the weight of the silence was oppressive. The air was thick, heavy with the lingering sense of something unspeakable. He had visited countless places of death, but this was different. Here, it felt as if the very ground was soaked in sorrow. His team, composed of experienced investigators and a local historian, set to work documenting the strange phenomena. They spent days combing through the church and its surrounding grounds. The historian, an elderly man named Samuel Alcott, was the first to notice something odd, something that hadn't been visible before. On the far wall, hidden behind layers of dust and cobwebs, was a faded mural. At first glance, it seemed to be a simple depiction of the church's founding. But as they examined it closer, they realized the image was much darker than it first appeared. The mural depicted the massacre that had been erased from the town's history, the bloodshed that had stained the land centuries ago. It showed a group of people, men, women, and children being dragged to the church, bound and gagged. Behind them stood dark figures, their faces obscured by shadow. The mural was a grim reminder of the past, a past that the town had tried so desperately to forget. As the days passed, Creed began to notice something even more unsettling. The town, which had once felt alive with the bustle of everyday life, was now eerily quiet. People spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously as they passed by. There was a palpable sense of fear in the air, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. Creed had seen his fair share of strange cases, but nothing like this. The longer he stayed, the more he felt the pull of something dark, something ancient that was tethered to St. Gabriel's, something that did not want to be uncovered. And then, one night, as he sat alone in his room, staring at his notes, he heard it, the faint sound of whispers, distant but unmistakable. It was as if someone was speaking to him from the shadows, calling him, urging him to uncover the truth. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it filled his entire room. His heart raced, and for the first time since arriving, he felt true fear. Whatever it was that haunted this place, it was aware of him and it was not pleased with his presence. The more Ellis Creed dug into the town's past, the darker and more oppressive the atmosphere became. Each new layer of history he uncovered only seemed to confirm the sinister truth that St. Gabriel's was not just a town with a cursed church, it was a place where evil had always existed, waiting for the right moment to resurface. One evening, after a long day of research, Creed sat down with Samuel Alcott, the town's historian, in the dimly lit study of the local inn. The flickering light of a candle cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the air smelled of must and old paper. Alcott, weary and frail, spoke in a low voice, as if afraid to be overheard. "I've heard stories, Mister. Creed, stories from old families, stories my grandfather told me when I was a boy, things I never thought were more than just tales to scare children. Creed leaned forward, sensing that Alcott was on the verge of revealing something crucial. Kissed down. The town's history is a dark one. Centuries ago, long before the church was built, there was a massacre here, Alcott continued, his voice trembling. The land was home to a community of indigenous people, and the settlers who arrived in St. Gabriel's did not come peacefully. They slaughtered men, women, and children, driving them out or killing them outright. It was a bloody time, and for years, the land remained haunted by the spirits of those who had been wronged. Creed's pulse quickened as the historian's words settled over him. He had suspected this, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. Alcott continued, his eyes darting nervously around the room. When the church was built, the settlers thought it would be their redemption. But they didn't know, no one knew that they had disturbed something ancient. The massacre, the spirits didn't leave. They stayed. And over the years, people began to vanish. No one dared speak of it. It was as if the land itself demanded payment. As Alcott spoke, Creed could feel the weight of the historian's words pressing down on him. The massacre wasn't just a tragic event, it was the start of something much darker. It was the catalyst for the evil that had taken root in St. Gabriel's, an evil that had been festering for centuries. But why was it happening now? What had triggered this resurgence of terror? Creed spent the next several days combing through the town's records and archives, piecing together the fragmented history of St. Gabriel's. He discovered that every time the town had experienced prosperity, the darkness had returned. A child's death here, a strange disappearance there, small incidents that, at first glance, seemed like nothing more than coincidence, but upon closer inspection, they were part of a far larger, more deliberate pattern. The events of the past seemed to repeat themselves in an endless loop, each cycle culminating in more bloodshed. What was clear to Creed was this: the town was caught in a vicious cycle, a pattern that seemed to be unbreakable. Each generation was marked by the same horrors, the same deaths, and now it was happening again. But why? What force had held this cycle in place? And was there any way to stop it before it claimed even more victims? The closer Elias Creed came to uncovering the truth, the more he realized that the force behind the deaths wasn't something as simple as a curse or a malicious spirit. It was something far deeper, more insidious. It was as though the very essence of St. Gabriel's had been marked by an unseen hand, guiding the town into a never-ending cycle of suffering and death. And the more Creed investigated, the more it became apparent that the spirits of the past weren't just lingering, they were active, and they were aware. Reports began to trickle in from the townspeople, each one more bizarre than the last. People claimed to hear faint whispers at night, sounds of soft footsteps echoing down empty streets. Others reported seeing fleeting shadows at the edge of their vision, figures that appeared to be watching them, waiting. The town, which had once been a place of light and warmth, it was now gripped by an all-encompassing darkness. In one particularly chilling instance, a local farmer named James Whitlock told Creed that one night, while he was working late in the fields, he had seen something he could never explain. A figure pale and translucent had appeared in the mist, standing just beyond the fence that separated his land from the churchyard. It had beckoned to him, a faint and ghostly gesture, its face obscured by the swirling fog. James, frightened, had hurried inside and bolted the door behind him. He had not been the same since, but the most disturbing accounts came from those who had ventured into the church after hours. Several townspeople, brave souls who thought they could face whatever darkness lurked within, had entered the church, but none of them had returned the same. They spoke of voices that seemed to come from nowhere, voices that whispered their names, coaxing them to come closer. One man, a farmer named Henry Pratt, claimed to have seen something that froze him to his core, a figure standing in the shadows, its eyes glowing red, staring directly at him as if it knew everything about his life, his sins, his fears. The final straw came when a group of children, curious and eager to test their courage, sneaked into the church late one night. What they saw there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They reported seeing shadows moving on their own, twisting and stretching across the walls like grotesque figures. One child swore that, for just a moment, the figure of a woman appeared, her eyes empty and hollow, staring into the hearts of the children with a coldness that made them shiver to their very bones. It was clear now the spirits of St. Gabriel's were not just hauntings from the past, they were active, present, and vengeful. They were watching, waiting, and reaching out from beyond the grave. But why? What had they been waiting for all these years, and more importantly, what would it take to end the cycle of torment that had plagued the town for centuries as the town of St. Gabriel's continued to spiral deeper into fear and despair? Elias Creed began to realize that the answers he sought weren't just hidden in the past, they were buried beneath the very ground he walked on. The more he dug into the history of the church, the more it became clear that the darkness that plagued the town was not an external force, but something far more deeply rooted. It was a force that had always been a part of St. Gabriel's, woven into its foundation, into the very soil itself. Creed's investigation took a chilling turn when he decided to visit the site of the massacre that had occurred centuries before the very land upon which the church had been built. The spot had long been forgotten by the townsfolk, buried under years of superstition and silence. But now, standing in the shadow of the church, Creed couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of forgotten memories. The land beneath his feet seemed to pulse with an energy that he could not explain, as though it were alive, waiting for something or someone. It was here that Creed made his most disturbing discovery. While inspecting the churchyard, he found a small clay overgrown graveyard hidden behind the building, obscured by a wall of thick ivy and brambles. The gravestones were old, eroded by time, and many of the names had long since been worn away. But what caught his attention were the symbols carved into the stone symbols that matched those he'd seen inside the church. They were etched into the stone with an unsettling precision, like the marks of some ancient ritual. This was no ordinary burial ground. The dead here had been marked, tied to something far darker than any typical burial rite. As Creed knelt to inspect the gravestones more closely, a sudden chill ran down his spine. He realized that the graves weren't arranged in a conventional pattern. Instead, they formed a strange, almost ritualistic circle, each stone pointing toward the center. The deeper he looked into the arrangement, the more he began to see the connection of the victims of the massacre, the townspeople who had died over the years, and even the recent deaths. They were all tied to this spot. This circle was more than just a burial ground. It was the center of the curse that had gripped the town for centuries. Suddenly, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. It was as if the earth itself was moving, alive with a dark energy. Creed stumbled backward, heart pounding, as the whispers that had haunted him for days seemed to grow louder, swirling around him like an invisible storm. The air grew thick with an almost tangible presence, a force that was both ancient and terrible. And then, through the darkness, he saw it, a shadow tall and dark and standing just beyond the edge of the circle of graves. It was a figure, vaguely human in shape, but its face was obscured by darkness. It was watching him, its eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. The whispers grew more frantic, more urgent, as if the figure was calling to him, drawing him closer. Creed stood frozen, unable to move. As the figure seemed to step forward, its presence growing stronger with every passing moment, he had come here to uncover the truth, to stop the deaths and free the town from the curse that had haunted it for so long. But now, standing in the graveyard, staring at the shadowy figure, he realized that the truth was not something he could easily escape. The darkness that had consumed St. Gabriel's was far more than a curse. It was a living, breathing force, and it had been waiting for him. Elias Creed's heart hammered in his chest as he stared into the shadowy figure, which seemed to pulse and sway with an unnatural rhythm, as though it was not entirely bound by the physical laws of the world. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the air itself was thick with the voices of those who had been lost to this curse. And in the suffocating silence that followed, a realization slowly began to settle in Creed's mind, the force behind this torment. The thing that had killed so many before him was not a supernatural being or a malevolent spirit, it was something human. The figure before him, standing just at the edge of the circle of graves, shifted once more. The darkness around it seemed to separate, revealing a faint glimmer of light, a face human, but impossibly pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to reflect the suffering of those who had been lost. It was then that Creed understood this was no ghost. This was a person, or, at least, a remnant of someone who'd been long forgotten. The whispers turned into words, soft but clear. "You shouldn't have come here." Elias Creed. His blood ran cold. The voice was not just a whisper in the wind, it was a deep, resonating sound that echoed through his very bones. The figure stepped forward, the darkness surrounding it retreating like a shroud, revealing a face that was once human but now twisted with a look of sorrow and anger. "I'm the keeper of this town," the figure continued, its voice low and slow, as though every word was dragged from a place of deep pain. "I have watched over St. Gabriel's, guarding the sins of its people, every death, every tragedy. It is all by design. The cycle cannot end. It is my duty to ensure that it continues." Creed's mind reeled, his thoughts rushing in 1,000 directions at once. The keeper. The figure standing before him seemed like an echo of the past, someone who had long ago succumbed to the very evil that had haunted the town. But how could this be? How could a person still alive, still bound to the land, be the source of the terror? Why, Creed asked, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Why continue this? Why kill these people? Over and over, the keeper's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, a glimpse of something ancient and terrifying flickered in them, because they are the price for the sins of the past. Long ago, this land was stained with blood, and it will be paid for, over and over again, until no one remains to remember what was done. You are part of it now, too. There is no escape. Creed's legs buckled beneath him, and he stumbled backward, falling to the ground as the weight of the words pressed upon him. The keeper's words were not just a warning, they were a condemnation. The cycle had been set into motion long ago, and now it seemed that Creed himself had been chosen as the next victim. But Creed wasn't about to surrender to the darkness. He'd come to end the cycle, not to become a part of it. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing for any solution, any way out. He remembered the graveyard, the way the gravestones were arranged in a ritualistic pattern. There had to be something there, something that could stop this madness once and for all. He turned to face the keeper, his voice trembling with newfound resolve. "I will end this. I will break the cycle." The keeper's lips curled into a twisted smile, and for a brief moment, The darkness surrounding him seemed to intensify. You think you can end it. You are not the first to try, As the keeper's words echoed in the graveyard, the ground beneath Creed's feet seemed to shift again, the earth groaning as though it were alive, reacting to the challenge. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. But Creed, shaking and breathless, stood firm. He had come to uncover the truth, to stop the deaths, and he would not leave until he had. The keeper's laughter filled the graveyard, echoing in the silent darkness like a funeral bell tolling. The very air around Elias Creed seemed to tighten, pressing in from all sides as the weight of the curse bore down on him. He could feel the eyes of the town's spirits watching him, their cold gaze boring into his very soul. The ground beneath his feet quaked, and the shadows around him stretched unnaturally long, crawling like tendrils seeking to pull him into the abyss. You think you can stop what is inevitable. Elias Creed, the keeper, sneered, stepping closer, his form now almost solid. The darkness clung to him, wrapping around his body like a second skin. This town is bound by blood. You're nothing but a fleeting moment, a speck of dust in the never-ending march of time. But Creed didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. His mind raced, trying to piece together everything he'd learned. The cycle, the curse, the spirits. What had he missed? What was the key to breaking it? And then it hit him, like a sudden flash of clarity in the darkness. The circle, the graves, the ritualistic arrangement. It wasn't just a random placement of bodies, it was a binding, a powerful symbol that anchored the curse to the land. The deaths weren't just happening in a vacuum, they were tied to the very earth beneath them. And if the cycle was going to end, it wouldn't be enough to confront the keeper or destroy the spirits. He had to sever the connection to the land itself. "You're wrong," Creed said, his voice steady despite the tremor of fear that still rattled his bones. "This cycle, this curse, it ends tonight." The keeper's mocking expression faltered for just a moment, his eyes flicking to the graves. A flash of something ancient and angry crossed his face. And for the first time, Creed saw a flicker of doubt in the keeper's eyes. "What are you planning?" Investigator the keeper growled. "Do you think you can undo centuries of pain with a few words?" Creed stepped forward, forcing himself to stand tall despite the growing dread. "I don't need words," he replied, his voice growing more certain with each passing second and lower. "I need the truth. And I'm going to find it here, in this land, and in the graves of those who suffered. I will free them, and I will free this town." The keeper let out a guttural growl and lunged at him. But before he could reach him, the ground beneath them shook violently, splitting open as a deep, guttural sound filled the air. It was as if the earth itself were crying out, the souls of the dead rising from their graves, their voices blending with the whispers that had tormented Creed for so long. The keeper faltered, his dark form flickering. "You don't understand. You cannot defeat what has already been set in motion." But Creed wasn't listening. He had already begun to trace the symbols etched into the gravestones, his fingers trembling as he touched the ancient markings. They weren't just symbols, they were the key. Each one represented a piece of the puzzle, a piece of the town's tortured history. He muttered the names etched into the stone, the names of those who had suffered, and with each name, the earth seemed to grow colder. The ground rumbled again, and this time, it felt different. The power that had held the town in its grip for centuries was beginning to unravel. The keeper screamed in fury as the earth split wider, a powerful force pushing against him, pulling him into the very depths of the land he had sworn to protect. The spirits, once silent, began to cry out, crying not in pain, but in release. The land, soaked in centuries of sorrow, was finally beginning to let go. Creed stood firm, his hand still pressed against the gravestones. As the keeper's form began to fade, swallowed by the earth itself, he knew the curse was breaking. But as the final remnants of the dark figure vanished into the abyss, a chilling thought struck him. The darkness had not been defeated entirely. The cycle was broken, but only for the moment. The land would heal, yes. But the ghosts of St. Gabriel's would never truly rest. Not completely. They would always be a part of the town's history, a shadow that would never fully fade. The silence that followed was deafening. The oppressive weight that had hung over St. Gabriel's for so long seemed to dissipate, replaced by a strange, almost surreal stillness. The earth had stopped trembling, and the air, once thick with malevolent energy, had cleared. Elias Creed stood motionless, his hand still resting on the gravestones, but the ground beneath him no longer pulsed with dark power. The keeper, the figure that had haunted this place for so long, had vanished, swallowed by the earth that had borne witness to centuries of suffering. But as the dust settled and the night air grew still, something inside Creed couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. The land had been purged of its immediate darkness, yes, but the town of St. Gabriel's had been marked forever. The very soil here carried the weight of countless lives lost, countless tragedies that could not be easily erased. And so, Creed found himself at the centre of a haunting realization. While the cycle of death and suffering might have ended tonight, the scars left behind would never heal. The spirits of the past, the ones who had perished in the massacre and those who had died in the years since, would never fully leave. They had become intertwined with the land, their souls bound to it in a way that transcended life and death. The town, though free of its immediate torment, had been marked by a shadow that would forever linger in its history. As Creed walked back toward the town, the once vibrant streets now felt empty. The townsfolk, those who had survived the horror, had gathered near the church, their eyes wide with disbelief, as if they, too, were unsure of what had just transpired. There was no celebration, no sense of relief. Instead, there was only a collective understanding that St. Gabriel's had been irrevocably changed. Creed approached the group, his steps heavy, his thoughts clouded with the weight of what he had just witnessed. "It's over," he said softly, though the words felt hollow. He had ended the immediate threat, broken the curse, but in doing so, he had opened a door that could never be closed. The ghosts of St. Gabriel's were no longer confined to the past, they were part of the town's fabric now, woven into its very existence. An elderly woman, whose face was creased with the lines of time, stepped forward, her eyes full of grief. "You may have freed us from the darkness, Mr. Creed," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "But we will never be the same. The land, the town, it's all been tainted. And no matter how much we wish it away, it will always be here. It will always live in our hearts." Creed nodded, unable to find the words to respond. What could he say? That the cycle was broken. But at what cost? The town had been freed from the clutches of terror. Yes. But its soul had been forever stained by the events that had unfolded in those dark months. The past was no longer something they could outrun. It was something they would live with, always. As the night fell deeper, the shadows that clung to the edges of St. Gabriel's seemed to linger longer than they should have. The faint sound of whispers drifted through the air, as if the spirits of the town were still speaking, still watching. And though the townsfolk had endured, and the curse had been lifted, there would always be the lingering question, was it truly over? The answer, it seemed, would never be clear. But the town of St. Gabriel's, forever marked by the events that had unfolded, would carry on, shaped by its dark history. And as for Elias Creed, he left that night with more than just answers. He left with the knowledge that some things, no matter how hard you try, can never truly be buried. Years passed, and the town of St. Gabriel's slowly began to heal, or at least to appear as though it were healing. The eerie stillness that had once suffocated the streets began to lift, replaced by the more familiar hum of daily life. The church, now abandoned, stood as a silent sentinel at the edge of town, a reminder of the darkness that had nearly destroyed them all. Its once welcoming doors were now sealed shut, the bell that had tolled erratically for so long now silent. Its echo lost to time, the townspeople tried to go on, though the scars of the past lingered like an invisible wound. The memories of the 23 victims, the souls lost to the curse, were not easily erased. Families, some of whom had lost loved ones to the madness, tried to rebuild, but there was always something in the air that spoke of the town's dark history. It was never quite gone. Even those who had been part of the resurrection of hope in St. Gabriel's, those who had survived the horrors that had unfolded in the months before, carried the weight of the past in their eyes. Creed, too, left. He returned to his work, but something inside him had changed. The town of St. Gabriel's had left its mark on him, just as it had on everyone who had set foot within its cursed boundaries. He never spoke much of what happened during those dark months, but he could never forget the face of the keeper, the pale, twisted figure that had tried to stop him. It haunted his dreams, a reminder that some evils, no matter how many years have passed, never truly fade. As for the town itself, St. Gabriel's remained a place that few dared to visit. Those who did come spoke of an unease that clung to the land, a quiet tension that seemed to emanate from the very ground. The church, though abandoned, still held an eerie allure. Occasionally, someone would claim to have seen a shadow moving within its walls. A figure standing in the window, an echo of the past that never fully let go. But the cycle, at least for now, had ended. The darkness had been pushed back, though not entirely eradicated. The spirits of the past had found rest, though their whispers remained, lingering on the edges of St. Gabriel's like the faintest breeze, just out of reach. The 23 victims of the church had been avenged, their suffering acknowledged, but they, too, had left their imprint on the town. It was a legacy, one that could not be ignored. Perhaps one day, St. Gabriel's would be forgotten by all but the faintest of memories. Perhaps one day, new generations would come and go, their lives unmarked by the horrors of the past. But for now, as the sun set on the town, its streets quiet and its skies darkening, there was a lingering sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from joy, or from the healing of wounds. No, it was the kind of peace that settled only after a storm had passed, leaving behind only the faintest remnants of its fury. A peace born from survival. And in that silence, where the echoes of the past still resonated, St. Gabriel's, though free, would forever bear the weight of its history,